The morning sun spilled over the manicured lawns of Willow Creek, a suburban enclave where every mailbox was painted the same shade of slate gray and every blade of grass seemed to salute in unison. It was the kind of place where you could hear the hum of sprinklers before you heard birds, and where the rules of the homeowners association known locally as the WO were treated like scripture. But on this particular Tuesday in May, something was brewing in the backyard of 127 Maple Lane, home to the Harrisons, and it smelled like rebellion. I was sitting at the kitchen table, halfway through a bowl of oatmeal, when I glanced out the window and saw it. A gleaming silver padlock on the door of our backyard shed, winking in the sunlight like a smug bureaucrat. Next to it, a red sticker screamed, "Access restricted, WCHOA violation pending." The shed wasn't just any shed. It was Pop's pride and joy, built with his own hands back when Willow Creek was just a scattering of houses and dirt roads. Inside were rusted paint cans, fishing gear, and a locked box of war medals Pop never talked about, but polished every spring. Me father-in-law, Walter Harrison, was standing in the backyard, coffee mug in one hand, a chipped ceramic squirrel in the other, staring at the lock like it had just spat on his shoes. At 78, Pop was a wiry Vietnam vet with a squint that could cut glass and a grudge against authority that had only sharpened with age. "What in the hell is this?" I asked, my spoon frozen midair. Pop didn't answer. He just muttered something about spineless clipboard carriers and stomped toward the garage. That was my first clue we were in for trouble. The trouble had a name. Gerald. Gerald Thompson, the WCHOA's compliance officer, was a 42-year-old man with the charisma of a tax form and a beige sedan that screamed middle management. His license plate read, Order 4 LYF, and he wore polo shirts so crisp they looked like they'd been ironed with a ruler. Gerald had a reputation for sniffing out violations to tall grass, unapproved mailboxes, wind chimes that jingled too loudly, and slapping fines on anyone who dared to breathe outside the WCHOA's 127-page rulebook. Gerald had slipped into our shed that morning to inspect for compliance. Pop, spotting the lock and doing some quick math, realized someone was still inside. Most folks would have knocked or called the HOA's hotline. Pop. He grabbed his welding torch, cranked the heat, and started sealing the shed door shut like he was fortifying a bunker. Sparks flew, metal hissed, and from inside came Gerald's voice, shrill and panicked. "Hey, I'm in here. What are you doing?" Pop didn't flinch. He just kept welding, humming what I swear was Merle Haggard's Okie from Muskogee. I stood frozen in the backyard, one hand clutching my phone, filming the chaos while my brain screamed, "This is bad." My wife, Ellen, burst out of the house in sweatpants and a half-tied scarf, yelling, "Walter, what in God's name are you doing?" Pop paused, lifted his welding mask, and said, "Restoring justice." By the time my son, Mike, joined us, Gerald had stopped shouting and started bargaining. "This is unlawful confinement. I know my rights." His voice was muffled, tinged with the kind of fear you get when you realize your prison doesn't have a bathroom. Pop adjusted his torch and replied, "So's trespassing, but I still got a medal for it." Ellen was threatening to call 911. Mike was trying to pry Pop away from the glowing steel, and I was still filming, torn between horror and admiration. The neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Delaney peered over her fence with opera glasses. The Carter kids were streaming it on their phones. #ShedLockdown already trending. And then, like a vulture in yoga pants, Helen Baxter, the WCHOA president, rolled up in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, looking like she'd been personally offended by our existence. "This is outrageous," Helen snapped, her pen poised like a dagger. "Highly illegal, highly disruptive, highly satisfying." Pop shot back, tossing his welding gloves onto the grass. Gerald, still trapped, began tapping on the door. "I have asthma. Someone get me a protein bar." Mike, ever the peacemaker, slipped one through the roof vent, which only made Helen glare harder. "You're enabling a crime," she hissed. The cops didn't show up that day, which was surprising. Maybe nobody wanted to explain to dispatch that a septuagenarian had welded a bureaucrat into a shed over a landscaping dispute. But as the sun set, casting an orange glow over the sealed shed, Pop stood beside me, arms crossed, staring at his handiwork. "They've forgotten what it means to own something," he said. "This neighborhood's gone soft. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that came to mind. Pop, you welded a guy in a box. He shrugged. From inside, Gerald yelled. I can still hear you. Pop lit a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have, smiled, and said, Good, let it sink in. That night, the backyard was quiet, but the air crackled with tension. Gerald had been in there for hours, surviving on protein bars and a bucket labeled, Emergency Use Only. Ellen was brewing coffee like she was prepping for a deposition. Mike was pacing, muttering about lawsuits. Pop sat on the patio, sharpening a butter knife for no reason other than to look menacing. And me? I was still filming, because what started as a reflex was starting to feel like a duty. The next morning, Gerald's voice echoed from the shed, weaker now. There are laws against this. Federal laws. Pop didn't look up from his coffee. The feds never had to mow a lawn under tyranny, he said. Mike tried to reason with Gerald. We're working on it, okay? Just a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, Gerald snapped. You welded me in here with a bag of rotting manure. That's when we remembered the compost pile in the corner. Gerald's voice took on a new edge of panic. Something's leaking. It burns. Before we could respond, Helen's golf cart squealed into the driveway. She marched toward us, clipboard waving like a battle flag. You have 30 minutes to release Gerald, or we'll escalate to the neighborhood council. Mike blinked. That's not a real thing. It will be, Helen snarled. We can fine you into bankruptcy. Pop looked up from his knife. Try me, Duchess of Dull. Helen wasn't alone this time. She'd brought 2 board members, Roger, a man whose personality was a pair of khakis, and Linda, who once fined us for overly festive Christmas lights. They stood like sentinels as Helen waved her clipboard. Gerald is a valued officer conducting a routine inspection. He broke into our shed, I said. It's not breaking in if it's HOA jurisdiction, Helen retorted, citing some obscure bylaw. Jurisdiction? Pop stood, slow and deliberate. He stepped into my shed. Now he's learning the cost of not knocking. The neighbors were gathering now, drawn by the shouting and the faint smell of scorched paint. Mrs. Delaney brought a lawn chair. The Carter kids sold lemonade. Across the street, Mr. Patel set up a tripod camera, muttering, This beats cable. Inside the shed, Gerald was tapping again. I need a blanket. And maybe a counselor. Mike rubbed his temples. We need to de-escalate. Open the door. Apologize. Maybe send him cookies. Cookies. Pop snorted. We're not baking for a man who padlocked our shed. The standoff was spiraling, and I kept filming, knowing this was bigger than us now. The question was, how far would Pop take it? And how far would Willow Creek let him? By the second day, our backyard at 127, Maple Lane looked like a scene from a low-budget war movie directed by a man with too many power tools and a chip on his shoulder. Pop Walter Harrison had escalated things in a way only he could. The shed, now a welded fortress with Gerald Thompson still trapped inside, stood at the center of a freshly dug trench, lined with old campaign signs and solar-powered garden lights that glowed like runway beacons. Pop had even rigged up a makeshift flagpole using a broom handle and a faded dish towel, as if declaring the shed its sovereign nation. I woke to the sound of shoveling, not the polite kind you hear when someone's planting tulips, but the aggressive, rhythmic scrape of a man on a mission. Pop was knee-deep in the trench, his welding mask perched on his head like a battle helmet, a cooler labeled trench snacks at his side. Ellen, my wife, peered out the kitchen window and sighed. I thought he'd do this eventually, she said, pouring coffee like she was bracing for a siege. Just not this soon. Mike, our son, stood on the deck, clutching a mug so tightly I thought it might crack. He's building a moat, he whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it real. An actual moat. Out by the shed, Pop shouted. Laugh now, but when they send tow trucks, this'll slow him down. Inside the shed, Gerald had moved beyond panic and into something resembling performance art. He'd found an old walkie-talkie in a storage bin and somehow got it working, broadcasting his plight across Willow Creek's baby monitors and one unfortunate neighbor's Bluetooth speaker. This is Gerald. His voice crackled from the flower bed. Day 2. Air quality's holding, but there's a mildew smell. I may have negotiated peace with a roach. The WCHOA didn't take kindly to Pop's trench. By mid-morning, Helen Baxter's golf cart screeched into our driveway, trailed by a cloud of dust and self-righteousness. She stormed across the lawn, waving a packet titled Emergency Protocol for Non-Compliant Homeowners. "This is an act of aggression," she declared. "Excavating without WCHOA approval violates subsection 17, part landscaping without licensed intent." Pop looked up from the muddy trench, wiping his brow with a bandana that read, "Live free or die." "It's not landscaping," he said. "It's survival." Helen's face turned the kind of red that suggests an imminent explosion. "You have until sundown to fill this in, or we'll initiate a level 5 response." Mike, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Helen, let's slow down. Gerald's in there. Can't we talk this out like neighbors?" "Neighbors?" Helen scoffed. "You lost that privilege when your father-in-law turned a property dispute into a hostage crisis." That afternoon, Pop upped the ante. He strung barbed wire made from coat hangers around the shed and hung empty paint cans on twine to create a clanging alarm system. At one point, he staked a plastic flamingo in the dirt like a medieval warning sign. I pulled him aside, my voice low. "Pop, is this getting out of hand?" He fixed me with a stare that could have stopped a tank. "This ain't out of hand, Tom. This is what happens when a man's pushed too far." The neighborhood, meanwhile, had turned into a suburban circus. Spectators arrived with lawn chairs and coolers, some even bringing portable fans. The Carter twins were selling T-shirts that read "Free Gerald" on one side and "Shed Life" on the other. Helen tried to shoo them away, calling it an unauthorized gathering, but her shouts only drew more phones. The situation was going viral. A news van was parked at the end of the street. A drone buzzed overhead. Someone started a betting pool on how long Gerald would last before demanding a lawyer. Then came the bombshell. Gerald, still broadcasting from his shed prison, started talking. "This HOA's a racket." His voice crackled through a neighbor's radio. "They use fines to pad their budget. The bylaws are bloated with nonsense nobody reads. I'm not even a real inspector. I got this job because I knew Helen's cousin from a spin class." The crowd gasped. Phones were raised, recording every word. Mrs. Delaney nearly dropped her binoculars. Helen went pale, her clipboard trembling. "He's delusional," she barked. "Oxygen deprivation." But Gerald kept going. "Last year, we denied a pergola permit because Helen said it looked too Mediterranean. We found a widow for a birdhouse that said peace. This isn't about community, it's about control." Helen lunged for the radio, yanking the cord like she was stopping a bank heist. But the damage was done. Neighbors whispered. Even Roger, Helen's khaki-clad lackey, looked uneasy. The tide was turning, and Gerald, of all people, was leading the charge from inside a 10 by 12 shed. That evening, Mike waved a white dish towel tied to a rake, shouting, "We're open to negotiation." Gerald's voice came soft through the walkie-talkie. "I want a lawyer, 2 energy drinks, and a new job title." "You're getting nothing but a write-up," Helen screamed. Then a voice from the crowd yelled, "Give the man his drink." Another joined in. "Let him out spilling the truth." The chants grew louder. Helen panicked, retreating to her golf cart and radioing for backup. Minutes later, another cart arrived, carrying a man in a pressed shirt with a therapist's smile. "Hi," he said, raising his hands. "I'm Nathan, the WCHOA's conflict resolution consultant." Pop laughed so hard he nearly fell into the trench. "A life coach? What's next, aromatherapy?" Nathan pressed on, undeterred. "I'm here to find a solution that honors everyone's truth." Pop leaned forward. "My truth is I welded a man in a shed, and I ain't sorry." Nathan set up a circle of lawn chairs and insisted Gerald share his emotional journey via speakerphone. Gerald delivered a monologue about his fear of confined spaces, his distrust of authority, and his lactose intolerance. It was bizarrely compelling. Helen stood in the background, arms crossed, radiating fury. The neighbors, meanwhile, were eating it up, passing around popcorn and pizza slices. As night fell, Pop added tiki torches around the trench for ambience, making the scene look less like a crime and more like a rebellion. The shed had become a symbol, and Gerald, whether he meant to or not, was its voice. I sat with Pop by the trench, the flames flickering, and asked, "How long can this go on?" He sipped from a thermos that smelled suspiciously like bourbon. "As long as it takes for them to remember a home's a castle, not a contract." The next morning, the air in Willow Creek felt different. It wasn't just the scent of charred grass or the faint whiff of fertilizer from Gerald's shed. It was the buzz of defiance, the sense that something was waking up. Helen hadn't shown her face since Gerald's radio confessions, and Roger had peeled off his WCHOA badge like a man escaping a cult. In their absence, hope was creeping in. Pop sat by the trench, a faded flag draped over his shoulder, watching the shed like a general guarding a fort. Gerald, now a local legend, had taken to narrating his ordeal like a podcast host. Day 3, he said through the walkie-talkie. I've named the roach Carl. We're working on trust. The neighbors weren't just spectators anymore. Some were quietly rooting for Pop, especially after word spread that Helen had once fined a veteran for flying a flag that was too large. The shed wasn't just a shed, Anna Maria, it was a monument to resistance. And Pop? He was digging in. The sun rose on day 4 over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the trench that now encircled our shed like a moat from a fever dream. The backyard of 127, Maple Lane had transformed into a fortress of defiance, with Pop Walter Harrison at its helm, his welding mask glinting in the morning light like a knight's helmet. The shed, still sealed with Gerald Thompson inside, stood as a battered but unyielding monument to Pop's war against the WCHOA. The air was thick with the scent of scorched earth, stale fertilizer, and something new, the electric hum of a neighborhood waking up. Pop was up before dawn, reinforcing the trench with cinder blocks and old hubcaps, muttering about strategic depth. Ellen, my wife, was in the kitchen, baking lemon bars as if sugar could fend off a lawsuit. Mike, our son, was on the phone with a lawyer friend, pacing the deck and whispering about criminal liability. And me, Tom, I was still filming, my phone now a chronicle of this absurd, escalating saga. Gerald's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie, now a neighborhood radio station. Day 4. Carl the Roach has abandoned me. Morale is low. Send coffee. The WCHOA, desperate to regain control, doubled down. That morning, a college intern in a WCHOA polo shirt delivered a 20-page citation packet, listing violations from unauthorized earthworks to disruptive lighting displays. Pop skimmed the first page, snorted, and used the rest to shore up a weak spot in the trench. At least they're good for something, he said, tossing the intern a granola bar for his trouble. By noon, the WCHOA sent in their big gun. A sleek SUV pulled into our driveway, and out stepped a man in a tailored blazer, his teeth so white they could have doubled as a flashlight. Hello, he said, clasping his hands like a preacher at a revival. I'm Victor Grayson, certified mediator and expert in community conflict resolution. I'm here to restore harmony. Pop didn't look up from his trench diagram. You bring a bulldozer? Victor chuckled, unfazed. I bring empathy. Then you brought the wrong gear, Pop said. There's a man in my shed and a dictator on my lawn. Unless you've got a crowbar, you're useless. Victor tried anyway. He set up a circle of folding chairs in the backyard, insisting we all, including Gerald, via speakerphone share our truths. Ellen humored him. Mike tried to play along, and I sat there, camera rolling. Pop, meanwhile, folded Victor's conflict resolution pamphlet into a paper boat and floated it in the trench. Helen Baxter, the WCHOA president, arrived with her lackeys, Roger and Linda, her clipboard now a talisman of fading power. Gerald, from the shed, muttered, I just want a nap and some dignity. Victor opened the floor. Helen went first, her voice dripping with venom. The Harrisons have violated 32 bylaws, endangered a WCHOA officer, and undermined the moral fabric of Willow Creek. We demand immediate compliance. Gerald cut in. I demand a pillow and an apology. Pop leaned forward, his eyes like flint. I demand an HOA that doesn't fine kids for drawing hopscotch on the sidewalk. The neighbors, now a daily audience, cheered from their lawn chairs. Victor's smile faltered, but he pressed on, suggesting deep listening. Then Helen dropped her bombshell. As president, I'm invoking the Sapphire Clause, Section 62, subsection F, she announced, pulling a laminated sheet from her binder. If a homeowner disrupts community harmony in a sustained and hostile manner, the WCHOA can initiate forced relocation. Ellen stood, her lemon bars forgotten. You're trying to evict us? Helen didn't blink. This house is part of a community, and communities have standards. Pop rose, slow and steady, like a storm gathering. You're not building a community. You're building a prison with extra paperwork. I built this house in '69. Signed a mortgage, not your bylaws. The yard fell silent. Then Gerald's voice crackled through the speaker. He's right. I found the original charter in a toolbox. This property predates the WCHOA by 4 years. The shed's protected under a grandfather clause. Pop can do whatever he wants with it. The crowd erupted. Linda gasped. Roger backed away like he'd seen a ghost, and Helen's face froze in a mask of disbelief. Victor stammered, "This is a development. Perhaps we could hug it out?" Pop ignored him, walking to the shed and tapping the door. "Gerald, you just turned traitor. Want out? Or are you joining the fight?" Gerald paused. "Do I get an energy drink?" "Green only," Pop said. "The rest tastes like regret." As Pop prepared to cut the weld, a voice shouted from the fence. "Hold up." It was Carl Nguyen, the quiet guy who'd filled in his koi pond after Helen deemed it too exotic. He held up a folder. "I've got something. Proof Helen's been funneling WCHOA funds into her backyard sauna." The neighbors gasped. Someone yelled. She said it was a community gazebo. Carl opened the folder, revealing receipts for heated tiles, a sound system, and a meditation waterfall labeled as common area enhancements. Helen turned the color of old cement. "That's slander," she hissed. Linda, breaking ranks, muttered, "I knew her backyard was too steamy." Pop cut the weld just enough for Gerald to slip out, blinking into the sunlight like a man emerging from a cave. His polo was stained, his hair a mess, but he stood tall. "I've seen the truth," he said, "and it smells like manure and corruption." Pop clapped him on the shoulder. "Welcome to the rebellion." Helen tried to flee to her golf cart, but the crowd blocked her path. Someone tossed a garden gnome at her tires. The revolution had arrived, and it was wearing flip-flops and sunscreen. That night, we sat around the trench, sipping lemonade and watching my footage go viral. Gerald, now a folk hero, was drafting a new WCHOA charter on the back of old fines. The shed stood triumphant, and Pop, leaning back in his lawn chair, grinned like he'd just toppled a small empire. I looked at him. "What's next?" He took a swig from his thermos. "Next, we build something better. Maybe a barbecue pit." Gerald, sitting nearby, whispered, "Can it not be airtight?" Pop smirked. "No promises." The next morning, Willow Creek was a different place. Kids drew chalk murals on driveways without fear of fines. A neighbor hung wind chimes that tinkled defiantly. The shed was now a landmark, with tourists snapping photos and kids pointing at it like it was a war memorial. Pop, true to form, was already planning his next move, a wooden podium on the front lawn, for speeches, he said, hammering nails with the focus of a man who'd just won a war. But the WCHOA wasn't done. At noon, a letter slid under our door, sealed with the WCHOA crest and smelling faintly of lavender and desperation. It announced an emergency community vote that evening at the rec center, a last-ditch effort to expel the Harrisons from Willow Creek. Ellen was baking furiously, Mike was Googling exile laws, and I was filming, because this wasn't over yet. By the evening of day 5, Willow Creek was a powder keg with a lit fuse. The letter from the WCHOA had declared an emergency community vote at the rec center, a final attempt to oust the Harrisons from 127 Maple Lane. The shed, now a symbol of defiance with its blackened welds and makeshift flag, stood silent in our backyard, but its shadow loomed over the neighborhood. Pop Walter Harrison was hammering together a wooden podium on our front lawn, muttering about speaking truth on my soil. Ellen was stacking lemon bars like they were ammunition. Mike was rehearsing apologies to an imaginary judge, and I, Tom, was filming, my phone now a weapon in this suburban war. The rec center, a squat building usually reserved for yoga classes and potlucks, had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Plastic folding chairs were arranged in rows, a podium from the annual bake sale stood at the front, and a WCHOA banner hung crookedly on the wall. The air smelled of stale coffee and nervous anticipation. Neighbors filed in, some clutching notepads, others whispering about the shed like it was a living legend. Gerald Thompson, freshly freed and sporting a borrowed Hawaiian shirt, sat near the front, sipping an energy drink and looking like a man who'd seen the inside of history. Pop strode in last, his work boots thumping, a faded American flag draped over his shoulder like a cape. He didn't sit. He stood at the back, arms crossed, his welding mask tucked under one arm as if daring anyone to challenge him. Ellen handed out lemon bars. Mike hovered near the exit, and I kept my camera rolling, capturing every tense glance and muttered comment. Roger, the khaki-clad WCHOA board member who ditched his badge, called the meeting to order, his voice shaky. We're here under Article 29 of the Willow Creek Covenant to vote on the removal of the Harrison family due to recent events. Pop stepped forward. No microphone, no permission, just a voice that could silence a storm. Recent events? You mean your board breaking into my shed, locking it, and thinking you could bully us out of our home? You want to vote? Vote on why you're running this place like a dictatorship with better landscaping. The room murmured. Gerald gave a slow, theatrical clap. Roger fumbled with his binder. Mr. Harrison, please, no grandstanding. Son, Pop cut in. I faced down bigger threats than your newsletter in '71. You don't scare me. Then the miracle happened. One by one, neighbors stood. First was Mr. Patel, who recounted being fined for excessive marigolds in his garden. Then Mrs. Delaney, who'd been threatened over a hummingbird feeder shaped like a pineapple. A widow named Clara spoke softly about a fine for a porch flag that said hope. Years of bottled-up frustration poured out, each story a crack in the WCHOA's armor. Even Linda, the board member who'd once championed beige mailboxes, stood. I don't even like neutral tones, she confessed. I like coral. Helen Baxter was absent, rumored to be under investigation for her sauna scandal, but her influence lingered in the board's nervous glances and the thick binder labeled emergency measures. Roger tried to steer the meeting back to the vote, but the room was no longer his. Gerald stood, his voice steady despite the faint smell of compost still clinging to him. I've seen what this HOA does, he said. It's not about community. It's about power. I say we dissolve this board and start over. The crowd roared. Roger's binder slipped to the floor. Victor, the mediator, suggested a group reflection, but no one listened. When the vote came, it was swift and unanimous. The Harrisons stayed, the current WCHOA board was dissolved, and a motion passed to draft a new, simpler charter. Gerald, of all people, was tasked with leading the rewrite. The meeting ended in applause, followed by an impromptu potluck where neighbors shared ribs, potato salad, and stories of their quiet rebellions. That night, we sat around a fire pit in our backyard, dug without WCHOA approval just because we could. The trench glowed faintly with solar lights. The shed stood proud, and Pop sipped from a mason jar, his grin that of a man who'd fought a dragon and won. Think this piece will hold? I asked. Pop shrugged. Long enough for the grass to grow. Longer if folks remember they've got a backbone. Gerald, scribbling on old WCHOA notices, read aloud. Article 1. No fines for lawn ornaments unless they're actively causing harm. Reasonable. Pop nodded. Before we turned in, he nailed a plaque to the shed door, carved with, "Enter with permission or don't." I've got a torch. No one argued. The shed had earned its peace, and so had we. The weeks that followed were a slow exhale after a long, wild scream. Willow Creek changed, not overnight, but steadily, like a garden shaking off frost. The shed became a local landmark, its welds a badge of honor. Kids drew chalk arrows pointing to it, tourists snapped photos, and someone added it to Google Maps as the shed that fought back. Pop didn't boast, but there was a quiet pride in how he tended the marigolds he'd planted around its base, as if the shed was his old war buddy. Gerald surprised everyone by staying. He'd shaved his head, traded his polo for tie-dye, and started carving wooden signs. He built a bench outside the rec center, its plaque reading, "For all who've been trapped in something too small." His vlog, started as a joke during the shed ordeal, went viral, a series called Suburban Uprising that drew viewers from coast to coast. People watched Pop's welding, Gerald's confessions, and the neighborhood's transformation, captivated by a street learning to breathe again. The WCHOA didn't vanish, but it was reborn. The old board resigned, some quietly, others with petulant emails. The new charter, drafted by Gerald and a committee of neighbors, fit on 2 pages. It banned arbitrary fines, required community input, and mandated that complaints over 3 sentences come with a dessert. The next election was held on a neighbor's porch, with iced tea and index cards for ballots. Pop refused to run. "I built the battlefield," he said. "Someone else can draw the map." Helen resurfaced months later, after a stint in Arizona and a disastrous local news interview. She moved back quietly, started a vegetable garden, and wore so much tie-dye, she looked like a Grateful Dead fan. She'd nod at Pop from across the street, and he'd nod back, two old warriors acknowledging a truce. One Saturday, Willow Creek held its first Liberty Fair, a block party born from the ashes of WCHOA tyranny. There were bounce houses, water fights, and tables groaning with casseroles and questionable Jell-O salads. Gerald sang Sweet Caroline on a karaoke machine. Pop grilled ribs for hours, and no one measured the grass. Lawn flamingos wore tiny hats, and no one cared. The stars hung low over Willow Creek that night after the Liberty Fair, their light mingling with the glow of solar lanterns around the shed at 127 Maple Lane. The trench was still there, a scar of defiance now softened by marigolds. Pop Walter Harrison had planted with the care of a man tending a grave. The shed itself stood quiet, its welded seams like battle wounds, a testament to a war won not with bullets, but with stubbornness, truth, and a well-aimed welding torch. Pop sat in his lawn chair, sipping from a mason jar, the faint scent of whiskey cutting through the cool air. Ellen was inside, washing dishes from the potluck. Mike was scrolling through comments on my viral videos, and I, Tom, was filming one last scene. The shed, the fire pit, and Pop, a man who'd turned a tool shed into a revolution. I asked him, "Do you miss the fight?" Pop looked at me, his eyes catching the firelight, weighing whether to joke or preach. "You don't miss war," he said finally. "You miss the moment people remember who they are, when they stop bowing to a clipboard just because it's got a logo." He took a slow sip. "I never cared for rules, Tom. But I care a hell of a lot about people. When rules hurt people, you grab the torch." Gerald, now a fixture in our backyard councils, raised his glass and energy drink, naturally. "To the torch," he said. "To the torch," we echoed, clinking glasses under the stars. As I turned off my camera, I lingered by the shed, running my hand over its cool, scarred door. A new plaque had appeared below Pop's original carving, one I hadn't noticed before. It read, in rough-hewn letters, "Here stood a man, a flame, and a locked door." All three changed everything. I snapped a photo and sent it to Mike, who posted it online with the caption, "And so the WCHOA fell, not with a whimper, but with a weld." By morning, it had thousands of likes, shared by people who'd never set foot in Willow Creek but felt the shed's story in their bones. The months that followed were a quiet transformation. Willow Creek didn't just recover, it bloomed. Driveways became canvases for chalk art, unpunished by fines. Wind chimes sang in backyards, their notes a middle finger to the old bylaws. One neighbor built a treehouse without submitting a 10-page permit, and another painted their mailbox bright purple just because they could. The WCHOA, under its new 2-page charter, became a facilitator, not a dictator. Meetings were held at picnic tables, with lemonade and laughter, and complaints had to be short and sweet, preferably with pie. Gerald, the unlikeliest hero, leaned into his new life. He'd traded his WCHOA polo for a wardrobe of loud shirts and started a carpentry business, crafting benches and signs that dotted Willow Creek like markers of a new era. His vlog, Suburban Uprising, grew into a phenomenon, with episodes about the shed, the vote, and the fair, plus new segments on neighbors reclaiming their yards and lives. Viewers from Texas to Maine sent messages. "Our HOAs are just like yours, where how do we fight?" Gerald's answer was always the same. "Find your shed. Find your torch." Pop, true to form, stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't need the applause. He spent his days tinkering in the shed, now officially a historic structure, thanks to the grandfather clause Gerald had uncovered. He'd polish his war metals, plant more flowers, and occasionally weld something for no reason other than to keep his torch sharp. But there was a lightness to him now, a satisfaction in knowing he'd sparked something bigger than himself. When kids stopped by to gawk at the shed, he'd tell them, "Build something worth defending. Then don't let anyone lock it up." Ellen and Mike, once the voices of caution, embraced the change. Ellen started a community garden, free from WCHOA color restrictions, and Mike, inspired by the vlog's success, took up video editing, helping Gerald turn raw footage into stories that resonated. As for me, I kept filming, not because I had to, but because Willow Creek was now a place worth documenting, a place where people lived, not just existed. Helen Baxter, the fallen queen of the WCHOA, stayed quiet after her return. Her garden flourished, her tie-dye grew louder, and she never mentioned saunas again. Once, at a community barbecue, she brought a tray of brownies and set them next to Pop's ribs. He took one, nodded, and said, "Not bad." She nodded back, and that was Theta's ceasefire carved in chocolate. The shed itself became more than a landmark. It was a symbol of what happens when you push back. It appeared in local papers, on travel blogs, even in a sociology class at a nearby college, where students debated whether Pop's actions were justice or vigilantism. The debate raged online, too, with some calling Pop a hero, others a reckless outlaw. Gerald's vlog comments were a battleground. He stood up for his rights, versus, "You can't just weld someone in a shed." Pop didn't care. "Let him talk," he'd say. "Talking's better than obeying." One crisp fall morning, months after the fair, I found Pop sitting by the shed, staring at the horizon. The trench was gone, filled in after Ellen put her foot down, but the marigolds remained, bright against the shed's weathered wood. "You ever think it'd come to this?" I asked. He chuckled, a low rumble. "I just wanted my shed back. The rest? That's what happens when people wake up." Willow Creek was peaceful now, but it was a hard-won peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've fought for it. Dogs barked, wind chimes rang, and somewhere, a kid was drawing on a sidewalk without fear of a fine. Pop sipped his coffee, nodded at me, and went back to his tinkering. The war was over. The shed stood, and Willow Creek, for the first time in years, felt like home. As I walked back to the house, I thought about the shed's story, how a lock, a torch, and one stubborn old man had unraveled a system that had choked us for too long. It wasn't perfect, this new Willow Creek, but it was ours. Normal had been a cage, a world of beige mailboxes and silent compliance. Now, we had color, noise, and the freedom to be a little messy. The shed had done that. Pop had done that. And in some small way, we all had. I uploaded the final vlog episode that night, a montage of the shed's journey. Pop welding, Gerald's radio rants, the rec center vote, the fair. The last frame was the shed at dusk, its plaques glowing under a lantern. The caption read, "Freedom starts small. Find your shed." It hit 1 million views by morning, shared by people who saw in Willow Creek a mirror of their struggles against HOAs, bosses, or any rule that valued control over humanity. The story of the shed didn't end with Willow Creek. It spread, inspiring backyard rebellions and community meetings across the country. Gerald got letters from strangers, some enclosing photos of their sheds, others asking how to start their uprising. Pop, when told about it, just shrugged. Good. Let him build something. For me, the shed was a reminder that change doesn't come from waiting, it comes from acting. Even if your action is as wild as welding a door shut. It comes from people like Pop, who see a wrong and grab a torch. Like Gerald, who found his voice in a pile of compost. Like the neighbors, who stood up when it mattered. The shed wasn't just a shed anymore. It was proof that a single spark can burn down a system and light up a community. So, here's my challenge to you, the reader. What's your shed? What's the thing you're ready to fight for? The line you won't let someone cross? Drop it in the comments below. Share your thoughts on Pop's methods, heroic or reckless. Was he right to wield that torch, or did he go too far? And what about the bigger picture? How do we balance justice and order in a world full of petty tyrannies? Tell us your stories of standing up, of pushing back, of finding your torch. Because if Willow Creek taught us anything, it's that one locked door can change everything.